Good morning, or everybody, of course, also depending on when you are physically located. And I'm addressing now in particular the attendance of this event. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening. I am Stefano Valeri. I work as a researcher and research assistant here in Torino, in Turin, which is a city in the northwestern part of Italy. I will spend really few seconds and minutes just to introduce the organization I work at, and so the organization which decided to promote and launch the today webinar. We are called Fondazione per l'Ambiente, which actually can be translated in English as Foundation for the Environment. Foundation for the Environment is also this sort of spin-off initiative and research initiative, which is called Turin School of Regulation. Our foundation is a research and training organization which officially was born in 2004, and the main objective of its activity is related to the analysis, the economic analysis of regulation of local public services and of the so-called network industries such as water, mobility, transport, transit systems, energy systems. And of course, as you can imagine, during these latest years, all this kind of services was strongly affected and reshaped by the emergence of digital technologies, ICT, information and communication technologies. That's why we also decided to move towards the analysis of the regulation of digital mediated services and so-called digital platforms. So this was just to give you a little bit the framework of the event of today. We have been working on this kind of issues during these latest years, and in particular today, as you may have read from the webpage of the event, we're going to talk about the regulation of digital markets in general. Starting from a quite concrete issue, which is represented by the Amazon case. Of course, we see in general Amazon as one of the main prototypes and representatives of digital platforms. So we are not specifically and particularly interested in the field of logistics and delivery services as such. This is just a starting point in order to discuss what are the recent advancements and evolutions in the field of regulation of these services. We, of course, want to thank the three speakers that kindly accepted our invitation to intervene today. So we can start by introducing them really quickly. We have today with us MELTEM AKKAYA, who has been working for the Turkish Competition Authority for 22 years. She's also head of the Strategic Development Department of the same Competition Authority. She also has a long-standing experience of collaboration with us as an organization. She actively participated in the yearly editions of our summer school on regulation of local public services, which more or less is organized every year in Torino. And then we have also CRISTINA, who is professor of comparative private law at the University of Torino. Her research interests, of course, deal especially with all the issues at stake in the today event, and she's also part of a pretty new initiative named Turin Observatory on Economic Law and Innovation, which is, of course, a novelty in the context of the evolution of this kind of studies. And last but not least, as we're used to say in these cases, there is also with us GINEVRA BRUZZONE. She teaches at Louis University in Rome. She has, of course, a high level of expertise in the field of competition law and competition studies, and she also currently, if I'm not wrong, advisor for the Italian government in the field of reforms and competition law in the context of the National Plan for Recovery and Resilience. So I will not spend much more time in order to start this debate. As already said, we consider the Amazon case as a starting point for the today discussion. As you have read on our webpage, at the end of 2021, here in Italy, the National Competition Authority decided to issue a quite heavy fine against Amazon, more than 1 billion euros of fine because of abuse of its dominant position in the field and in the sector of online intermediation and e-commerce services. It was quite a heavy fine because it amounts more or less to 20% of the whole annual turnover generated by the company here in Italy. So we can start from this. We can start by considering why this happened, what led to this decision, if there are similar cases in other national contexts, and whether the case of Amazon can represent a sort of paradigm for the whole functioning of the business models traditionally adopted by this new form of company that we know and we label as digital platforms. So I immediately leave the floor to MELTEM BAİŞ AKKAYA. For all the attendants, of course, you can use the Q&A section, and if we will have enough time at the end of the several speeches, we will select some questions and we will turn them to our speakers. So thanks again for your attention, and see you afterwards.
Thank you, Stefano, and thank you, Turin School of Regulation, for giving us the platform to speak on this quite trendy issue of digital platforms, and in particular, Amazon case. I'm honored to be here and sharing with two distinguished colleagues. One more point before I start, or before all of us start: we are not citing or we are not criticizing what the national Italian competition authority did. They've done an amazing job, obviously. I've read the case. I tried to read the case as much as possible. It's a long, long case. They did an amazing job. So we are here to see if that would open another path towards a new era of competition enforcement, and where the case stands in between this digital sphere. So I'll try to briefly summarize the case. I'll ask GINEVRA to fill in wherever I'm not super well, because I'm not super informed about Italian case, details of the case. So the Italian authority, AGCM, but for this case, we would prefer to say Italian Competition Authority, opened an investigation on Amazon on April 2019 and notified it to the ECN. Then on November 2020, the EU also opened proceedings on exactly the same issues, this time excluding the Italian market, giving the floor to Italian Competition Authority to decide its own case. Amazon appealed this, but then the Commission didn't accept it, and so it declined. It paved the way for the Italian authority to decide first, and then perhaps the European side is going to come afterwards. As of December 2021, last year, the Italian authority announced its decision with a record-breaking fine. It's a huge fine indeed, 1.3 billion euros in today's currencies. That time I think was around 1.1 million euros. So it's a huge fine, as you all can imagine. The authority in its official announcement claimed a very strong cooperation with the EU Commission on the issue. So this shows that this is not going to be just a national case. It's going to have a European dimension as well. My two colleagues would fill in that part. The decision says, according to the decision's announcement, it says Amazon had violated Article 102 of the treaty, which is abuse of dominance. It harmed competing providers of e-commerce logistics services by tying the right of retailers on Amazon Marketplace to participate Amazon's Prime program to the retailer's agreement to use Amazon's own logistical service, that's so-called Fulfillment by Amazon, FBA, for this webinar. The agency then went on went on the findings. It's according to the findings of the case, Amazon holds a super dominant position in the Italian nation market for intermediation services on marketplaces, as is the case with the US. I just checked the numbers before this webinar and found out that last year, Amazon held a position of 41% of the total EU commerce numbers. In Italy, it's around the same number, but I'm not sure. I would ask my colleagues to correct me if I'm wrong, because Italian numbers weren't on the web. Anyway, So having a dominant position in the Italian market for intermediation services on marketplaces, Amazon leveraged to favor the adoption of its own logistics services, FBA, by sellers active on Amazon.it to the detriment of the logistics services offered by competing operators, as well as strengthening its own dominant position. I'm going to be a little more brief and open on these issues, but let's use the official language first. According to the case, again, only retailers, or if you like, sellers, who agreed to use Amazon's own logistical service, FBA, would have the right to participate in Amazon's Prime program. Prime program is the real factor indeed behind Amazon's huge growth. Without Prime, Amazon would not be here, according to the many commentators, and also according to the company itself. So why is Prime so important, and what is an FBA? How does Amazon Prime program work? Consumers who shop on Amazon, if they pay 36 euros a year in Italy, $139 in the US, would become Prime customers, and that would entail them, that would allow them to benefit from an unlimited 2-day speedy shipping for free all year, unlimited deliveries. Sometimes it's depending on the warehouse where you are shopping. Sometimes it's even on the same day delivery. So it's a huge, and then it's a very innovative indeed service. It's amazing because people like it, and Amazon loses a lot of money from its Prime structure, but it still keeps it in order to sustain its growth. Customers like it. Prime customers who pay for the who are members of the Prime membership, indeed are just covering the fixed cost of the service, while the marginal cost of the service is paid by sellers for every shipment Amazon makes. Prime program makes it easier, and this is for customers. And from the seller's point, Prime program, or being able to reach the Prime program members, is quite important, because Prime program makes it easier to sell around 7 million most loyal and high spending customers of Amazon. It's crucial for retailers, for sellers, if you like, because it provides important benefits, such as the first one is, it's a higher probability for sellers to be included in the buy box pop-up, which is a pop-up when you go to checkout. There's a buy box. It says it gives the offer of the day that Amazon thinks that's excellently suitable for the customer. So in order to pop up in the buy box as a seller, you have to be a member of the FBA now. The other exclusive benefit the Amazon Prime program gives is that you would be participating as a seller in Amazon's special events, such as Black Friday, Cyber Monday, when the huge sales indeed occur. So if you want to be a part of as a seller, if you want to be part of these huge events, you have to again be engaged in using FBA, which is the fast delivery system of the Amazon. The third benefit it sort of allows for the sellers is that you would not be you wouldn't be subject to a very strict performance criteria Amazon applies to its sellers when it chooses them to be on its website. If you are a member of FBA, if you use FBA, because in most of the cases, if Amazon thinks, if it doesn't think that you don't fulfill the requirements Amazon imposes on you, then it suspends your relationship with Amazon. So by having FBA, you would be out of these strict codes. So according to the Italian authority, Amazon tied the use of FBA, the fast delivery system, to the access to a set of exclusive benefits essential for gaining visibility and to increase sales on Amazon.it. A seller, a retailer that is equally effective as those who had signed up for FBA wouldn't get access to Prime if it does use a third-party logistics provider. So this is a discrimination indeed between two types of sellers without any justification according to the authority, and the authority is right in this case, because it doesn't say, Amazon doesn't say what these people are, what is the superiority of its service is. As a result, authority concluded that Amazon treated its retailers differently in a way that wasn't based on their performance or on any other objective criteria. Thus, Amazon, in our competition language, favored retailers, sellers who signed up to its FBA program, FBA delivery system, superior than those who are not. Amazon ranked its sellers according to subjective criteria it self-preferred in this case. So we have to ask ourselves here, what is the harm if we are talking about competition law? Well, the conduct harmed competing e-commerce logistics operators by preventing them from presenting themselves to online sellers as providers of services of comparable quality to Amazon's FBA. So because Amazon is quite important in any country, this time in Italy, if you don't provide your service as an online logistics provider to a seller, then your work, your return, your turnover may diminish, or you would not be able to, of course, compete with Amazon, with such giant. This conduct widened the gap between Amazon's market power and its competitors, also in the delivery of e-commerce parcels. According to the findings of the case, Amazon had engaged in a tying strategy by making access to Prime conditional on the use of its FBA service without any credible reasons or any efficiency justifications. It didn't come up with a sound justification. As a result of the abuse, Amazon's tying practices would strengthen its dominant position in the market for intermediation services offered by marketplaces. This would be so because retailers, sellers, would be discouraged to sell through multiple platforms. They cannot multi-home, because multi-homing in this case would mean that they have to negotiate this time with another logistics provider. And had they negotiated for a bunch of deliveries instead of Amazon here and then that one separately, they would have probably get a discount. In this case, they cannot get a discount because they have to work with Amazon and they work for other platforms. They have to use another logistics provider. So this is another mitigating factor. And according to the case, again, the authority, the Italian market, Amazon's conduct was found to have effects on both the Italian market for e-commerce logistics services and intermediation services on marketplaces. This is what a tying strategy does in competition terms. So the abuse finally is the fact that competing logistic and transport service providers were excluded from the market. This is the Amazon case in a nutshell, Italian national Amazon in a nutshell. That would be the European version of it. It's about to follow. I don't know how they're gonna decide. Perhaps that's the way that looks like. For the time being, self-preferencing is the mainstream. So if I wanted to comment on the facts and findings of the case before I give the floor to my colleagues on this Amazon session, so without being too speculative on what an agency or what an authority or how they decided, I myself, as a case handler of antitrust for more than 2 decades, I would have sided with other commentators, and I would have said it would have been sufficient to characterize Amazon's conduct as a classical standard tying strategy rather than applying or following the wording of self-preferencing. But the agency seems to have preferred to apply the reasoning developed by the famous European Commission's late decision of Google Shopping and evaluated the case around self-preferencing theories of harm. So in this point, it would be useful to say what self-preferencing is in Google Shopping, or what the Commission said in Google Shopping. According to Google Shopping case of the Commission, it said that Google was fined for favoring its own comparison shopping service over those of its rivals. So in Google Shopping, the Commission held that it was under no duty to prove that anti-competitive effects occurred, suffice to demonstrate that the conduct was merely capable of having or likely to have foreclosure effects regardless of its success in practice. The decision was criticized heavily for opening doors to a quasi-regulatory duty for dominant platforms not to favor one's own products. Now, this is where the story starts now for all of us. I think this is the real question to ask ourselves and our audience and our commentators. Similarly, Italian authority construed its case on a self-preferencing theories of harm, saying that Amazon favoring its own logistics services over those of its rivals. It looks like within the EU and jurisdictions who follow EU approach, like my home country, Turkey, we are quite keen to use Google Shopping case mindset of the Commission. We prefer to be using self-preferencing rather than tying or discrimination classical issues. We're using this extensively right now, so much so that self-preferencing by so-called gatekeeper platforms is deemed to be anti-competitive and has a place now in DMA, which I guess we're gonna debate in the next round. So another follow-up to this self-preferencing issue after DMA is that Germany, interestingly, enacted a rule that prohibits an undertaking of paramount significance, which is almost like a gatekeeper in that sense, competing from competition, treating offers of competitors differently from its own offers. So self-preferencing is banned also in German laws right now in their amendments of competition law. Perhaps Ginevra and CRISTINA would fill me in, because I read that also in Italy there is a law under construction that is the same path, that is gonna be making self-preferencing unlawful. Is that true? This is what I read yesterday when I was Googling. I heard that there's a legislation coming like this, and also in Italy.
Yeah. I think they're going to answer immediately.
yeah, that would be nice. Because
No, thanks, MELTEM, because you already had us to in a way, enlarge and broaden the perspective. We are looking at this case, since, as we said in the introduction, we are not just examining the specific Amazon case. You already mentioned the Google Shopping case. So I think that now Ginevra Bruzzone and CRISTINA PONCIBò̀ can add some further points, yes, in order to enlighten all the issues and the notions and the conceptual and the law concept that you mentioned. Just a brief couple of words before giving the floor to Ginevra Bruzzone. Of course, the Amazon case in particular, as specified by MELTEM when talking about the high level of preference expressed by customers towards these services, sparked a huge debate, as far as I know, also inside the Italian community of economists, because of course, after the decision of the competition authority, lots of people said that in this case there was a trade-off between efficiency and consumers' welfare. So I think that this is also another interesting point to investigate. Many of them said that actually this was a decision which punished too much the efficiency gains. With all this kind of issues still to examine, I leave the floor to Ginevra Bruzzone. Thanks.
Before Ginevra starts, can I add one more point?
Yeah.
We are in Turkey also working on our economy of commerce is all, Ministry of Commerce is also working on a legislation which is going to be adopted soon on banning self-preferencing by a gatekeeper totally. So it looks like self-preferencing conduct is going to be unlawful, deemed unlawful all around the world following Commission's decisions. And the second point, I think we're going to be deciding later on. We're going to decide the case and the outcomes on consumer welfare later on. Is that okay? So thanks.
Okay. Well, we will discuss regulatory initiatives in the second round. Now, in this first round, I will focus on the Amazon case. And this is a very interesting case. And after the excellent presentation by MELTEM, it is easy for me to discuss it. It is not necessary to describe the case, I can discuss it. And we have two main issues. Understanding how digital platforms work, what do we learn from this case about how Amazon behaves, what do we learn about the conduct of Amazon? And the second issue is what do we learn in a competition policy perspective? What are the main features of the Italian Competition Authority decision, and what are the challenges for antitrust enforcement? The notion of abuse, the proof issue, and so on. Let us start from the facts. MELTEM already described the case. So the issue is who has access to the Amazon Prime label and to the related advantages. And it is interesting that initially these advantages were thought only for Amazon own products. Then they were extended to the products of other sellers on the platform, provided that they use the logistics services provided by Amazon, the fulfillment by Amazon logistics integrated services. And this was the first step. And in this way, Amazon extended the benefit of the possibility to obtain the Amazon Prime label to other suppliers, to other vendors, not to other providers of logistics services. And everybody knows that the FBA is an efficient service. They put very special care for timely delivery and are really careful also with reverse delivery, the management of returned products, customer care. It is an efficient service. And surveys in Italy show that consumers consider a reliable delivery process a crucial factor in their e-commerce deals. And if we look at the strategy of Amazon from a micro perspective, it is interesting that in the provision of FBA services, there is no exclusivity. It is paid on a pay-per-use basis. So vendors can use FBA for some products and not for others. And indeed, many vendors use FBA for some products and not for others, and for the platform and not for other platforms. And the prices for this service are not higher than the prices of competing logistics services. What is interesting is that this service by Amazon is clearly targeted on a subset of products, the products which have a high turnover, because products which are sold infrequently pay a lot in order to participate in the FBA program, because they pay a costly daily storage fee. And the idea is that Amazon wishes to discourage an inefficient occupation of warehouses. So the absence of exclusivity on one hand, and the different price you pay for, in case of products with a high turnover and products with a small turnover, clarify that here the idea is not the attempt to monopolize logistics services, but the idea by Amazon is to provide a very efficient logistics services in order to increase the number of products sold by through the platform, and to strengthen its power in its core businesses. So the idea is not monopolizing contiguous markets, the monopolization of logistics services, but the idea is strengthening the core business of the marketplace. And we are aware that in the marketplace, we have network effects. And so the larger the number of sellers and products involved in the platform, the higher the barriers to entry, the more difficult it becomes for competitors to compete with the Amazon marketplace. Another interesting aspect is that following the start of the investigation by the Italian Competition Authority, Amazon adjusted its approach and allowed competing providers of logistics services to gain access to Prime even without using fulfillment by Amazon, but using their own logistics services under a so-called seller fulfilled Prime program. The idea is that Amazon fixed some standards and kept the system under strict control, controlled the price, controlled, impeded providers of logistics services to have direct relationships with the vendors. But basically, they were free to use their own logistic services and still have access to Amazon Prime. So there was a progressive expansion of the scope of the number of subjects, vendors, but also providers of logistic services, which may have access to the Amazon Prime advantages. What is the view of the Italian Competition Authority? The view of the Italian Competition Authority is this is not sufficient. Amazon is super dominant. It cannot make access to the Amazon Prime label and to the other commercial advantages conditional on using FBA. And also the second solution, the remedy proposed by Amazon, is not sufficient because the system allowed competitors to have access to Amazon Prime by providing their own logistics services, but Amazon still acted as an intermediary in the system. And the authority said, no, Amazon should not act as an intermediary. It should set the quality standard, and that's all. And competing service providers should be able to have access to the system. So what does this case show in terms of the strategy by Amazon? In my view, it shows very clearly that in this case, not necessarily in other cases, but in this case, the attempt is not the monopolization of other markets, but is strengthening the competitive position in the marketplace. And if we look at the competition policy perspective, what is the kind of abuse we are considering? Probably we can say it is a leveraging case because all cases of exclusionary abuse have a leveraging element. But when, as MELTEM said, the Italian Competition Authority says it is a self-preferencing case, well, this is a controversial approach because the self-preferencing approach basically means that it is a quasi per se prohibition. A super-dominant company should not self-prefer. And the only possibility is to provide objective justification. So you are allowed to self-prefer only if you show that the others are less efficient than you. And this is the approach, a form-based approach. But in the Google shopping case, we had a case which was completely new in the competition policy perspective, because it was a case of an algorithm which produced biased results. Here we have a more traditional situation in which we have a company, and the issue is, should this company grant access to something which is of this company, a label, a trademark, in order to ensure effective protection of competition. And so, in my view, we should not use a form-based approach, say this is a self-preferencing, or this is tying, or this is, we should go back to the main questions we should address in competition cases. So the questions are, is there a foreclosure? If Amazon does not grant access to the advantages, the result is that we impede effective competition on the market for logistics services. Is this foreclosure, is there a causal relationship between the conduct by Amazon and the decreasing share of its competitors? So a focus on foreclosure. Is there a true foreclosure effect resulting from this conduct? This is important because granting access entails costs. So in order to impose a duty to deal, we as competition law enforcers have to justify the duty to deal. So we have to show that there is a foreclosure effect, an actual or likely negative impact on effective competition on the market for logistics service. And we have to go beyond and show that it is an anti-competitive foreclosure. We have to tell a theory of harm, showing, for instance, that competitors will not be able to provide the service because of this conduct. Services of a high quality, efficient services will not be able to reach economies of scale and so on. And the same for alleged negative impact on competition by competing platforms. So we should shortcuts in dealing with these cases, even if they are attractive, of course, because if we want to reach a systematic approach, we should address the main questions we should address when applying competition rules. Otherwise, we end up by protecting competition, an intra-platform competition, but we are not sure that we are really protecting also competition in the market. Also, following this approach, and I will finish, we are become able to discuss the remedy imposed by the Italian Competition Authority, because if we look at what is the impact on competition, what is the impact on competition variables, when the Italian Competition Authority tells Amazon, you should not control the working of the logistics system, you should give the task to an independent trustee, both for your own logistics services and to the other services. Okay, but what is the impact on the quality of the logistics service? What is the impact in terms of costs? If we address these cases not in an emotional perspective, but from a more standard competition law perspective, we are able to discuss the pros and cons of the approaches, and we are able to find a reasonable approach which may still lead to the prohibition of the conduct, but in my view, in a stronger way.
Okay, thanks a lot. It was very clear, and I think that that you gave us already a series of points that maybe could be discussed in the further and last round of the webinar. By the way, I had to correct myself, because before, when I left the floor to Ginevra Bruzzone, I said that there was a trade-off between efficiency and consumers' welfare. Actually, I meant that there is a trade-off between efficiency and competition, and maybe this is the issue that was raised now by Ginevra Bruzzone, and I think that this is the issue at the center of the whole discussion about the potential impacts of the DMA. So we'll see this later. Now I would just like to ask Cristina Poncibò to help us put the Amazon case in perspective in the broader European context. If you have to share your screen, you can do it. If there is any kind of issue or problem, please let us know, because I know that you had some slides, and thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Stefano. I hope you can hear me. If you see any issue, please let me know while I'm talking. So it's a pleasure to be here with you and to discuss of Amazon case in context, because I think you know, it opens really a number of research questions about how we conceive, we understand, we think to competition policy and regulation. So just let me share my screen and my presentation. I hope you can see it. I promise I will be very short in relying on slides, and that I make it bigger. So giving context. Italy, I mean, I say unfortunately, is not, as we know, the only case or part of a few bundle of cases, because we have a number of recent abuse of dominance cases all around the European member states. And I think it's important to map a little bit to give you the context of what is going on. And contrary to the approach proposed by Professor Bruzzone, I try to categorize, but the point raised by Professor Bruzzone is a matter of reflection for all of us, in the sense that we always try to go to our traditional categories or to develop new categories to accommodate the facts of cases concerning the digital market. So basically, it could be a suggestion to try to think to principles or to problems, and not in terms of categories. But in my case, I started by categories. And so I focus on exploitative use of personal data cases. And we have a case, the Facebook case that we know of 2019. Then we have the Google sandbox that is in the UK ongoing. We have many ongoing cases, obviously. We have cases of tying Google Android that we know in the EU, decided by the EU, and 2018, Google AdSense, EU 2019, Apple Store, EU ongoing, and then we have about time. Then we have another bundle of cases dealing with preferential access to customer data. Again, Amazon, EU ongoing, and Facebook, EU ongoing case. And then we have self-preferencing that we've just mentioned. And in this case, in this area, in this category, I've tried to map Google Shopping, different, but dealing with self-preferencing as a category. EU 2017, and then we find Amazon Logistics, the case decided by the AGCM, the Italian Competition Authority. About Amazon in particular, I think I totally share the view of Professor Bruzzone, in the sense that there is a lot of, you know, attention for these cases now, and we tend to be a little bit driven by emotions, you know, and negative impressions because of context, because we see so many cases that are mushrooming, and we think how competition policy can impact and manage this flourishing of cases. So if we are less driven by emotions, we can think to the fact that indeed there is an issue that in case you give preference now to your services over competitors and third parties, if you can have an objective reason, I mean, you can give an explanation to the authorities, and the reason could be efficiency. If we think from the point of view of consumers, we know that consumers really, and we are consumers, I include myself, we benefit from Amazon.
Connection is.
Yeah, the connection is low. Yeah, maybe something similar happened before we started our conversation.
Okay.
Okay, let's see whether Professor PONCIBò can recover in a while.
Okay. So should we Ginevra or I, maybe we can continue. Ah, okay, she's back. She's back. Excellent.
Okay, here we are. Probably is the presentation that let's try again a couple of slides and then I'll stop presenting. So less problems, I think. So basically, the point of view of the consumer, in sense, having such an efficient system of delivery may be something that consumers may prefer, but we don't take this into sufficient consideration. Why? Because, as we know, when we discuss of what is the welfare of consumers, we have never been able to reach an agreement after decades and decades. We have traditional understanding and concepts, but this is still dispute idea in competition law, and especially when we face new digital markets. So as you see here, there are many other areas of impact, like and new categories for antitrust breaches, like leveraging platform and development, unfair trading conditions on customers and advertisers, and we see here the many cases we have. So I now stop the presentation in order to avoid that you risk not to hear from me. And so what is the point? What is the point here? We have a number of investigations that are going on in the EU, parallel investigation by EU Commission and national competition authorities, especially in certain EU member states, Germany, France, Italy, and then we have also ongoing investigations by the UK Competition and Market Authority as well. So, and we have categories. We can say that the most common potential abuses are traditional exclusionary abuses like time, or we can see new exclusionary abuses because platforms are creative, self-preferencing, preferential access to customer data and platform environment and so far, and then a revival of exploitative abuses, unfair trading conditions, and exploitative use of personal data as example. And we have a limited judicial review on that because cases are recent. So we have some, the EU General Court in November 2022 for Google Shopping case, and the preliminary ruling by the EU Court of Justice pending about Facebook case that we know. What is the point? And the question that is also good for opening the second part of our discussion: is antitrust enforcement effective or it is not effective? We can say it's not effective. Why? And this is a unique challenge, a new one. Why? The deterrence effect is extremely limited. If you impose on Google a penalty of 6 billion, it is not so relevant to Alphabet worldwide turnover. So it's a small fraction of Alphabet worldwide turnover. The length of antitrust investigation and judicial proceeding, as we know from Microsoft case, they could be long. And then there are also other issues that can be discussed that we know already, but I mean, it's good to stress again this point. Digital markets, they are quite unique, no? They show to have certain characteristics like extreme returns of scale. They have the well-known direct and indirect network effect that could be an entry barrier, and we have to manage the problem that every time is important the role of data, and that are part of this challenge of this analysis. For this reason, the point that Amazon brings to the discussion and to us is more important than managing logistics according to competition for the benefit of Italian market, but it is about the tools we have, we need to design for the future, and a bigger question, is it necessary to shift to ex ante regulation is not competition policy ex post, as we are used to think to competition in terms of ex post tools of investigations and public and private enforcement, but I mean in an ex post perspective, or the shift toward the ex ante perspective. And this is opening the way to the further discussion by colleagues in the second round of questions.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I would immediately start with the second round. Maybe we can use the same order we used in this first round in order to give Professor PONCIBò̀ the time to prepare again for the second speech. So the points for this last part of our conversation of today are exactly those which were raised by you during your speeches. So I would start from this. I would now again enlarge the perspective in order to see whether the recent advancements suggested by the European Commission with the Digital Markets Act can be actually effective, as you said, in reaching the ultimate goals that have been at least stated. And I mean, in particular, the idea of fostering innovation and competition. Is it necessary in a way to state this kind of objective, or rather we are testifying, so we are witnessing a sort of trade-off, as said before, between efficiency and competition? What is the way that can be foreseen for the future, even though we all know it's quite difficult, especially with these kind of challenges, to predict what can happen? So I would start again from MELTEM and then go on.
My understanding is competition enforcers and agencies and even states are quite scared of these platforms. They're scared of the dimensions and gigantic structures, and they want to combat these platforms. So our understanding, as is my experience in the digital sphere, is that we think that we are always too late because they're too quick in adapting to new challenges, and they always bring new challenges. They're too quick. Consumers love them because they are either free, their services are either free in the case of Facebook or Google Search, Gmail, or they are really charming in terms of price, as is the case with Uber, Amazon. So consumers love these products. Competition agencies instead are always looking at these platforms and this new economy with a question mark, because we think that short run consumers are okay in terms of consumer welfare, but what in the long run there are, because of the structure of the platform economics, winner takes all, network effects, all combined, you end up with a huge entity in one ecosystem, then another in another ecosystem. So we are left with too low choices. We don't have variety for the time being. The quality seems to be okay, but what is future? Then, as your point is quite nice, and it's a hot debate, and then what about innovation? For the time being, these innovative products are quite nice and appealing because you don't pay, or you pay too little in terms of the innovation that is served to you. So we are trying to be, as competition enforcers and as lawmakers, we are trying to be as creative as the ecosystems are. So we have novel conducts, and we are trying to come up with novel solutions, novel tools. Self-referencing. So what is self-referencing? If you think, imagine we are all just consumers who have no idea of what the competition language doesn't apply to us. What is self-referencing? So self-referencing is indeed, you should not favor yourself. So that means that it's normal for companies, put it differently, it's quite normal for a company in the classical economy sense that you should promote your own product over those of your rivals. But the problem is you have an infrastructure or alleged infrastructure that is your gatekeeper. Without you, your rivals cannot reach consumers. Then you have to allow them, you have to favor, you should not favor them. You should accommodate their needs as well as yours, and you should be treating them equally. And you are a company who is supposed to be making profits. Now, the question starts here. First of all, these companies are not gaining profits. They are having huge losses. Look at Amazon, look at Uber. They prefer to have growth, huge growth, amazing, mind-blowing growth over profits. They are not classical economy companies. They don't care about losses, and investors seems to be loving this strategy, since they're backed up by their investors all the time. If you look at Amazon, Amazon is losing money and having losses in subsequent years, and investors still back it. It's the same with Uber. Why is that so? Because they perhaps think that in the long run, things may change. The companies or the platforms may, in the end, have a huge profit. They're expecting a profit, obviously. And then the other thing is, let's get back to our self-referencing example. In the past, before platform era, we had the same line of cases. We used to have companies that controls the infrastructure, and we were all, again, expecting them to give access to their rivals. And that time we called them either you should not discriminate because you have an essential facility. And now we tell them, okay, you are a platform now, you're no longer a classical company, because you have, without you, sellers cannot reach consumers, your rivals cannot reach consumers. So you have a dual role. You are competing with your rivals and you are giving them access as a service provider yourself. So this dual role creates a conflict of interest, and you have to limit yourself. Forget about that you are a company. So you limit yourself. You should not favor yourself. Is that possible? How is that possible? And how can you limit this? Or so do we expect these companies, these platforms, to innovate, and to share the fruits of their innovation with their rivals? So this is, for me, that's a main question, and that's a hot debate. Of course, the answer is, unless they have justifiable efficiencies, so it's not just straightforward, but the path that we take seems to be quite giving these platforms a quasi-regulatory mode. So you have to expect them to be neutral as possible. I'm not sure if that would, because it's yet to be seen. I mean, we haven't seen the results yet. These moves, these new legislations, like in the form of DMA or legislations that are done in countries, in state countries, or in my country, in Italy, in Germany, would be fruitful, because I'm not sure it still leaves the door open to innovation or to innovate further. The question they ask themselves, and this is the case many times in their defense, these platforms defend themselves to competition authorities as, let me see the real, okay, they say, why innovate if equal access to the fruits of one platforms would have to be provided to rivals? What if any short-term benefits to consumers may be offset by long-term welfare losses due to lack of innovation? This is the food for thought for the time being. We don't know, it's yet to be seen, because the DMA places responsibilities on gatekeepers, so-called gatekeeper platforms, mainly for the time being by the design. It looks like these are GAFAM platforms. Certain duties not to do in the form of not to do this or do this and share this. And so it's, to me, it's a little bit too regulatory. I am not sure these cases are really, I don't want to be too straightforward, but are they really necessary? I mean, are we going too far? If you look at Facebook case, or the German Facebook case, data to be treated as a real commodity, and then, so, but then there is, of course, the side, and that I would leave the floor to my colleagues to decide further. But then there is, of course, this problem of consumer welfare. In the past, when things were straightforward, when we had easier companies defined in classical terms, consumer welfare was the goal, sort of, especially in the US. In in the European dimension, we were thinking about effects-based analysis, but in the US, it was too straightforward. When you have a look at the case, competition case, two things were analyzed. Are the consumers harmed by increased prices, or is the output restricted? If none, then the case was declined. Now with these platforms, usually providing either below cost prices or even zero prices, so the analysis is shattered, doesn't mean anything. So you cannot now look at consumer welfare indicators. Instead, you look at, rather than short term, we are trying to look at long-term effects. The longevity of the markets, will the markets survive? They would be tipped. Have the platforms gained too much market power? That is the case through undetected mergers and acquisitions, and through being too innovative. They were undetected for a long time, and then they have a huge market power then. Right now, we seem to be implying that now you become too big to control. There's no tool available. The existing competition tools are not available for you to get detected your conducts, abusive conducts. So we have to impose new rules. We're trying to be creative as the platforms are. My initial thoughts on this is this. So I would leave the floor to my colleagues to debate on it, and then perhaps we're going to have a wrap-up round. I have a few more questions to ask them. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. If we had time till 3:30, more or less, or 3:40 p.m. Okay, so I leave now to Ginevra, BRUZZONE.
We can't hear you.
You have to activate the. Yeah,
sorry. Here the issue is what tools should we have in our policy toolbox in order to effectively constrain the economic power in digital markets? This is the issue. And let us look briefly at our competition tools. Our competition tools are not completely ineffective. They are quite good, especially in Europe, because we have seen, we have heard from CRISTINA and from MELTEM that we have made an intensive use of our traditional tools, also in innovative ways. We have used the possibility to prohibit exploitative abuses. We have invented new ways to approach exclusionary abuses and so on. And something which is quite important is that when we adopt an impact-based approach in Europe, we don't look just at the short term, and we don't look just at price, but we look at the impact on price, quality, choice, and innovation in the short and in the longer term. And this allows us to have a broader view, which is very important when we deal with the digital platforms, because it is never an issue of low prices in the short term. So we are able to use our competition tools in order to prevent developments which may happen, which may still be negative for consumers, but in the longer term, looking at quality and looking at what happens to innovation. Still, there is a debate on how to complement our competition tools with other regulatory tools. And for instance, already now in some member states, we are using national rules, for instance, prohibiting the abuse of economic dependence, not the abuse of the dominant position, but the abuse of economic dependence to constrain the economic conduct of big techs, even in cases which are not traditional competition law cases. And we have new regulatory tools being introduced. For instance, in Germany, we have this section 19A of the German competition law, and we have the proposal of the Digital Markets Act, which is practically approved. We are closer to the final approval. the final approval. And here, what is the idea? It is not the perception that the competition rules do not work, but the idea is that since in digital markets we are aware of structural problems related to these business models, we can, by well-structured, more regulatory approaches, prevent some of the problems which otherwise we should have to deal with by a case-by-case application of competition rules. So we are trying to prevent problems. And so if we look, for instance, at the Digital Markets Act, we find an attempt to prevent exploitative abuses, and we find an attempt to prevent exclusionary abuses. And this is not a general approach. It is a number of specific prohibitions with this idea in mind. If we compare the approach of the Digital Markets Act with the approach of the German competition law and the approach of the United Kingdom to the same problem, we find an important difference. And in my view, the German approach and the UK approach is better, because under the German approach and the UK approach, the idea is that we identify some situations in which we allow the introduction of rules, ex-ante rules. But in the German model and in the UK model, the identification of the obligations is based on you look at a specific platform, you look at the specific problems of the platform, and you impose regulatory obligations which are aimed at correcting the specific problems of this platform with a role of the competition authority. Whereas in the Digital Markets Act, we have a less tailor-made approach. We have an attempt to adopt a more regulatory general approach, but which is still a list of obligations, of do's and don'ts, very specific and different from our traditional approach in competition law, because they are not based on general notions. You should not they are really you should not do this, you should not do that, you should do this. And this is less flexible, less than the German approach. And probably it may be too rigid, it may regulate too much in some cases and not really effectively in some other cases, but this is the approach of the MAL. And the hope is that by means of the regulatory dialogue between the gatekeepers and the Commission, when they will have to establish how to comply with this list, this very rigid list of obligations, they will find the way to adapt the very rigid obligations to the real problem, and to find a proportionate and effective way to address the real problems without imposing excessive or unnecessary obligations. This is what we hope for the Digital Markets Act, because the approach which has been adopted is an approach which is less flexible than the approach of the German competition law, a more rigid approach. So the hope is that by means of a regulatory dialogue, we will be able to reintroduce the principles of necessity and proportionality of the regulatory obligations which will be imposed on each gatekeepers in order to be able to effectively reach our objectives, which are the objectives of ensuring fairness and contestability of the digital markets.
Okay, thanks a lot. And Cristina and PONCIBޮ, please add your take.
I follow my comments follow perfectly the previous comments of participants and speakers. I'm a little bit less optimistic about the role of competition policy, in the sense that indeed shifting to ex-ante regulation is due to the fact that we have not been able to manage exposed by competition policy the problems caused by platforms. And shifting to regulation to solve, to prevent structural problems has a cost, in the sense that not all colleagues are so happy to see again the rise of regulation ex-ante, because it may hamper innovation. It raises the cost on businesses, and basically is a sort of, thinking that you need to intervene on the market design, and that competition policy exposed and no solutions. So I think the cost of regulation has to be taken into consideration in this. And then let me show you one point that it's curious, because you precisely address the comparative analysis of these regimes that we see that are emerging. The DMA, the Digital Market Act, the proposal by the EU, what they are doing in the UK, and what they are doing in Germany substantially. So basically I see similarities in the three regimes. They share common goals, fairness, contestability, managing innovation of digital markets. They all take into limited consideration, they do not focus at all on issues of consumer welfare. And they all are based on an idea, the idea of asymmetric regulation. That means we have to put certain, certain rules on the shoulders of a limited number of online platforms that are controlling the digital ecosystem. So basically the terminology is different. We have mentioned already the DMA says digital gatekeepers, the digital market unit in the United Kingdom, they used to say firms having strategic market status. And then we have the Article 19, letter A of the German law that we mentioned, you have mentioned already. They say firms of paramount significance for competition across markets. And it is not clear, not entirely clear to me what they mean, in the sense, if you, obviously it seems that there is a difference in their understanding that has to be deeply explored. Then we have all an expansion of merger control notification ex-ante. That means I try to identify the killer's acquisition, and we have differences. And this is precisely what Professor Bruzzone was stressing here. We see differences in the scope of application of this ex-ante regulation, in the way they identify the firms that would be subject to this burden, and in the enforcement approach. And we can discuss if what we think would be better, unless they go in the same direction, that is asymmetric regulation that I've just challenged a little bit. So the scope, the DMA thinks to core platform services, so thinks to specific sectors, while the other two are more, seems to be more open in the scope. We in the DMA, and it seems in the digital market unit in the UK, they focus on the mechanism of notification, but we are in the range of something that is ongoing. And in the German case, it is the National Competition Authority who has to designate the firms that are subject to this ex-ante regulation. Then we have enforcement. That is the point that has been raised. It is better to have a principle-based approach. So basically, in the case of the UK, they are planning to negotiate binding codes of conduct with the firms that are subject to regulation, or a better is a rules-based approach. That is, you have a fixed list of obligations in EU style, Article 5 and 6 of the DMA, the European Union proposal, or a case-by-case analysis that you mentioned. So the Bundeskartellamt may prohibit certain conducts under the section 19(8) of the German law. So basically the same trend, but with differences that may be extremely relevant, I think, now in defining the concrete application and implementation of the rules, so they can change in the implementation phase in a significant way. So this is, open for discussion. My point is, not specifically on the differences, why I like the case-by-case approach. It seems to me more flexible. So I totally agree again with what has been said. But at the same time, I'm thinking on this. I'm also trying to write on this point. For us, it has been quite clear, no? Competition exposed, you have merger notification, you can have some preliminary studies by the authorities that can be ex-ante, so they can put some sort of advice, they give advice to firms how to do ex-ante, but very limited. Now, in the past, everything has been exposed, but now the balance between the two, regulation and competition, seems to go in the direction of more regulation, at least in the European context. Are we happy with this? It is absolutely necessary to do that, knowing that it's costly, and probably the answer is it depends on the quality of the regulation and the amount of the regulation, because we know we have a tendency to over-regulate. And so basically, how this impact antitrust as we think to it? In the sense, can we move from competition policy exposed to some sort of market design? Because if we enlarge the picture, we do not have only regulation, the traditional regulation, the DMA, but we have some initiatives that are around, including regulatory sandboxes, or innovation hubs, experimental regulation, where you try to test solutions in a protected environment. This is also quite trendy, I think. And maybe market design is completely different from competition, or competition as a value could be included in design of the market to solve the structural issues that you have mentioned. This is obviously an invitation to colleagues to discuss and to comment, and to participants. So thank you very much indeed.
Okay, if you want, we have something like 15 or 20 minutes at most more. There's just one question in the Q&A section, which would bring us back actually to the Amazon case. It is very specific, and it's related to the definition, to the strict definition of relevant market in the Italian case. So the attendant of the webinar asks whether you agree with the definition of relevant market adopted by the National Competition Authority here in Italy, in the Amazon case. So whether Amazon should be considered dominant, as it happened in the online space of marketplace services, or whether, on the contrary, Amazon is just an operator of the bigger retail service, so including also the brick and mortar, I guess, and physical trade services. So apart from this question, of course, I invite you to answer this question here. I just would like to stress, and maybe also I ask the last question to you, to stress the point raised by MELTEM before, when she read the defense line, when she quoted the line used by some big platforms operators relating to the idea of appropriating the gains from innovation. So the question basically is just this. Even though we hypothesize a scenario in which rules and tools are actually good and able to produce the contestability of markets, are we sure that these markets are actually contested? So contestability against the possibility to see market contestation. So this was just last point. I think it could be interesting to be discussed, as you prefer, in terms of order of speech.
MELTEM, you go first.
All right, let's do the same. You are right. We're not, first of all, these platforms, of course, well, they are exerting market power on every way they can, because they are companies in the end. So the markets are not competitive as we think, although the products are either free or appealing prices. But then seeing that antitrust enforcement, as Christina is quite critical, or maybe she's right, has been, if you look at Google shopping case, it took 7 years to decide. So it's a long time. I'm not talking even on Microsoft case. So it takes really long time to decide a case. When the case is decided, perhaps the conduct or the market is already in a different state. So in order to tackle these hurdles, everywhere, including the European Union, they were trying to come up with solutions to these novel products. So they are right. I mean, but the ex ante seems to be the mainstream right now, whereas it was sideways. Now, all of us, including the platforms, would have to get used to this ex ante way of living, do's and don'ts. The question is, are we interfering too much with the business model of companies? That's a question we ask ourselves, and we should ask the companies also come up. And then when you look at the DMA structure, and it's not just DMA or just the European Union, all of the countries are working on similar products, similar legislation. Germany was the first one, UK did something different. The US is working, but still a little slower due to the political environment. My country, everywhere, Japan, they have worked on a very diligent work, similar to ex ante rules. So everywhere is the same right now. Ex ante is the mainstream and we have to get used to it. Perhaps, as Ginevra said, we're gonna find a common way of sort of polishing the sides of the strict regulations. So DMA, as it is right now, is too much, putting countries in a firm way, but maybe we're gonna learn and they're gonna learn and we're gonna negotiate on it. So the DMA from onset and before it started, of course, it's not coming to entry yet, but the worries are, I've just checked what the worries could be. And on my own work, I've just found that here is the thing. First of all, we have to, and since this is the last session, we have to be listening to both sides. We have to look at the consumer side and we have to look at the other side of the markets. Are the consumers harmed by prices? No, these are appealing prices, certainly not. Consumers receive good substantial benefit from these, for the time being, from these platforms. But look at the other side of the market. Do these platforms exert market power in other markets? Yes. Do they collect valuable data? That's the question. That's the main question indeed. And that's where the problem arises. Do they collect valuable data from their rivals through serving them in their own infrastructure? Definitely yes. Do these platforms make it impossible to compete in terms of tying, lower prices, self-preferencing? Definitely yes. Are they easy to replicate or compete? Unfortunately, no, they're not easy to complicate due to the network effects and first mover advantage and the structure of the platform economics. They're almost impossible to compete or replicate. This is why we end up with GAFAM and no one else. So what should we do? We try to update our legislations. We saw that, as Christina said, we saw that antitrust enforcement wasn't good enough. Although it worked for quite a long time, it wasn't enough, unable to detect some open points. There were voids. So we put them in Europe, DMA, in my country, in a different setting, but all of them are the same regulations in the end. So we end up with DMA structures, DMA style regulations. The critics are, the first one starts with the language. They say, the European Commission says it limited the regulation to companies providing core platform services. Although the word limiting is a bit misleading because the list includes every significant digital service indeed. It tells 10 services for the timing. It started with 7 and then another 3 was added. So these are online search engines, online social networking services, video sharing platform services, number independent interpersonal communication service, that's WhatsApp, operating systems, cloud computing services, advertising services, web browsers, virtual assistants, everyone is included. So it's not limited indeed. So any provider could easily be categorized as a gatekeeper, or it may even according to the language. So this is a little tricky. The other thing is that these, as Christina said, tech giants, GAFAM, that clearly is, they raise concerns that these thresholds to be defined as a gatekeeper was defined subjectively, not objectively. I personally do not know how they come up with these thresholds, but that should be a rationale behind it. I don't know how it was defined. So they said the thresholds even in themselves are subjective, not objectively defined. Then they say that there is another voice that is saying that the compliance cost would put a burden on platforms, which could be perhaps in the short run reflected to consumers, but I don't think it's a major burden on these platforms. According to the European Commission, it estimated that would be 1.4 million per year for platform. I don't think it's a big burden though. Maybe for small ones, I don't know, for big. And then again, the problem of innovation, chilling innovation, impact on innovation, but this is yet to be decided. We don't know, it's just a theory that we say that, or everyone is looking at, and we don't know. It may not be the result as we are scared. Maybe they're gonna be more, they may behave, let's hope, they may behave and innovation be still around. And then there's another thing, which is the startup issue. I'm quite in favor of startups, as everyone is, and startups, even there's a group of startups, that when DMA was discussed, they come up with a complaint to the Commission saying that they raised concerns, saying that the prohibition on acquisitions for systematically non-compliant gatekeepers, if implemented excessively, could risk interfering with the startup life cycle. Because startups, indeed, first of all, they like to be acquired. We have to be honest. They don't complain that they are acquired. A startup that is worth 4 million is easily acquired for 40 million, 400 million by these giants. So startups themselves complained to the Commission. That was an interesting point indeed. So they say that their relative freedom to acquire promising startups is good for the tech ecosystems, because this is how the ecosystems are alive. Without being able to acquire new services, new startups, the ecosystem is never alive. That's true. This is how, if you look at Google, by acquiring Google Maps, everything became easy. That's how the ride-sharing services started. So without GPS, you had nothing. So this may be a chilling effect. We don't know. That's my point. And that's the last point I wanted to raise. And I wanted to thank my colleagues for sharing the same platform, and Stefano for you to moderate, for your excellent moderation. And so I leave it to my colleagues, and then if there are any questions, I would like to answer later on. Thank you.
Thanks, MELTEM. You're always too polite. Okay. I would say Ginevra, Bruzzone, Cristina, and then I think we're going to close. So I kindly ask you to just take not more than 6-7 minutes each. Thanks.
No, I propose 3 minutes. As to the question on the relevant market, whether the relevant market is properly defined is always controversial. In this, in the decision, you find a SNP test was carried out, so you can look at the SNP test at the data, but basically all of us are aware that we are facing economic power when discussing these cases. As to the issue of chilling effects, the risk of over-regulating, basically, in my view, what we should do when applying competition tools is always stick to the principles. So always look for very clear theories of harm, looking at the whole set of variables, the short and the long term, price, quality, choice, and innovation, but be very clear on what we are doing, avoiding shortcuts, in order to maintain the strength of our system of competition law, because of the experience of the EU system of competition law shows that we became a good model for competition policy worldwide, because we were able also to show the legitimacy of our system, which is firmly based on in the rule of law and contains an appropriate system of checks and balances. And we should stick to the same checks and balances also when applying our tools in the digital markets. And when we shift to the use of regulatory tools, the same, because in our system we have the better regulation principles, and which tells that we should regulate only when it is really necessary and proportionate to pursue well identified public policy objectives. And we should be clear on the objectives, and we should be proportionate in the choice of the tools. And for instance, looking at the objectives, when we look at the DMA, fairness maybe is because we find fairness in many legislative instruments in EU legislation. Contestability is not usual in EU legislation, because we find the competition, but we don't find the contestability. And we should be very clear in explaining that contestability means elimination of barriers to entry in order to ensure effective competition. We should be clear that we are trying to, we always maintain a strong link with the protection of effective competition, because contestability is not a value as such. We cannot think of eliminating any barrier to entry, because we have we eliminate the specific barriers to entry in these markets, which we are trying to limit the barriers to entry in order to ensure effective competition. But the limiting principle is that we are trying to ensure, to maintain effective competition, because if the goal is not clear, also the application of the necessity and proportionality principle becomes confused. We don't know where to stop. If maybe someone understands that we are trying to remove any possible barrier to entry in these markets. It is not so. We are trying to ensure that in these markets, because of the specific barriers to entry which exist in these markets, we are doing something in order to ensure that also in these markets we ensure that there remains an effective competition. We don't reach a situation in which we have a monopolization of specific ecosystems. But we should also in our regulatory activity, we must remain very clear on the objectives and very careful when we propose and we introduce the instruments.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. So we close with Cristina PONCIBޮ, and then I'll briefly add two things for closing the whole session. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to give you some elements of reflection, maybe. First of all, to conclude, first of all, we see the emergence of three different regulatory regimes, no? The DMA, the role played by the Digital Market Unit in the United Kingdom, and the role that will be played by the Bundeskartellamt in applying the Section 19A of the German law. They share the view of asymmetric regulation for online platforms, so the same aims, the same goals, but the problem, in my view, is that they basically rely on different enforcement approaches. So basically, you see the rules by principles or rules by on a case by case, so enforcement risks to be different, and this obviously may create some sort of divergence in regulatory outcomes in these different three regimes. And then, you know, we have always the issue of how much is important to not reduce the free movement of online services within the European Union digital market, and also in the future, hopefully in the EU-UK bilateral trade. Then we have to think to the fact that we are going to risk to increase compliance costs and create some legal uncertainty for online platforms. That means for big players, but to create some sort of uncertainty in the application of these regimes. But to me, what is fascinating is the big question behind all of this Amazon case and what we are seeing cases around Europe in the EU. The question is if we think that we can find a better solution in the competition policy toolbox instead of shifting to ex-ante regulation. So this is my question, something that I'm still thinking possible, and a good way to discuss of the future of competition policy in digital market. That is something that we are doing but we have not reached to me an acceptable consensus of what we are doing. So it seems basically that for the EU at least, the answer is to regulate ex-ante the structure of the market, or not indeed the structure, and saying they regulate only big players, they fix certain rules on these players. I think a better market design in terms of structure, it's a very important outcome that we can pursue better with certain new tools like regulatory sandboxes. I mean, we are just at the beginning of this. We have to experiment, we have to test if this is the holy grail or if we can do something with regulatory sandboxes. It is just an example. But basically, in between competition policy, regulation, and new tools for market design, I'm definitely for better market design or competition policy than for. I think this has been clear. So basically, but it seems that it is not surprising that we are going in the direction of regulation, and we will see what will be going on. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for animating the debate in such a lively and thought-provoking way. We can conclude by leaving ourselves with this open question raised by Professor PONCIBÒ. By the way, I wish to particularly thank the Turin Observatory on Economic Law and Innovation of the Department of Law of the University of Turin, where CRISTINA PONCIBÒ actually teaches, because they actively contributed to spread the news of this event, and of course they actively contributed to animate the debate with the presence today here of Professor PONCIBÒ. Thanks, of course, also to the other two speakers, GINEVRA, BRUZZONE, and MELTEM, AKKAYA, and to all of the attendants of the webinar, which was recorded, so it will be available also online on our social media channels and other websites. I would close now the session, and thanks again, everybody.